Hi, and welcome to another episode of the Immigrant Success Canada's podcast, your coaching program for a successful and happy life in Canada. My name is Emmanuel Petrescu, and I got my co host and partner Charlie,
Hi everyone.
and we have a very special guest to our episode, Brad Moore.
Hi.
Before diving right into the questions that we have prepared for Brad today, I'll take a moment to remind our viewers and our listeners about our website, www.isc-go.com, where you'll find information about our program, but also links to all of our social media platform channels, contact forms, and these and the other podcast episodes along with their transcripts. So that said, Brad, before we dive actually into those questions, would you take just a couple of seconds to introduce yourself to our audience, who you are and what do you do?
Sure. First of all, thank you for inviting me. This is great. So I'm Brad Moore, and I live in Calgary, Alberta, in Canada, which is tucked on the eastern edge of the Rocky Mountains. So I was born in Canada. My parents were born in Canada on both sides. My grandparents were born in Canada on both sides. Their grandparents were born on
Wow.
Canada on both sides.
Wow.
So I can trace. I am an immigrant from way back, but I can trace it before I think 1750s or 60s is when
Wow.
on both sides when they came to Canada. So um, aside from being Indigenous or First Nations, I'm as Canadian as it gets.
Absolutely. Yeah. You are really Canadian.
Exactly what I wanted to say, as Canadian as one can
Wow.
get.
That's good to know. Yeah, that's great history. Yeah. Wow.
Yeah. So I
Uh,
have three. I have three boys. They're grown now. The youngest just turned 23 yesterday.
Happy
Then
birthday.
I have a
Belated birthday.
25-year-old who works at a heli ski company, and then my oldest is a 28-year-old, and he's in forestry. He's actually just completing his degree, his science degree from a university out in British Columbia. So
Congratulations.
yeah, and I've been married for 32 years.
Wow.
There you go.
Great achievement. Yeah.
Congratulations.
I had to remember that. I almost got it.
Okay, thank you for that introduction, Brad, so that our listeners are get to know you. So I guess, Brad, the first question I might have for you is, what is your view about immigrants in Canada?
So Canada is a country of immigrants. That's the first thing is you know with all shout out to Indigenous and First Nations who immigrated maybe 1,000 years before Europeans immigrated to Canada before it was formed. They came from Asia, probably by boat or across the land bridge. So North America, populated by humans, is always moving in from other places. Canada, Canada was became a country in 1867. So but well before that, it was really became what it is now through an immigration out of Europe and into Canada. That's why the majority of people in Canada, when I grew up, when I was young, looked like me. There's been a tremendous change in the makeup of what a Canadian looks like, and you're Canadian, Charlie's Canadian. The who a Canadian looks like and who they are can look completely different. And if you go, depending on where you live and where you travel, can be hard to find somebody who looks like me. They look like um, from different regions of the world. So, but everybody's Canadian. So Canada is more of an idea, a behavior, than it is of what you physically look like. So Canada is a country of immigrants. So it's not good, it's not bad, it's just what it is.
It's natural, one might say.
It's natural, absolutely.
Thank you for that answer, Brad. So I guess my next question is, what would be your advice? What are your thoughts, and how a newcomer to Canada could be more culturally, interculturally engaged with the Canadian culture? And the reason I'm telling you this is obviously macro level, but also micro level. If I tell Charlie or you about I just had a double double yesterday, you know what I mean. But arguably for the rest of the world, including US, they probably don't have any clue. So that's why I say macro level, but also micro in terms of the Canadian culture. What are your thoughts, and what's your perspective for a newcomer?
Great. So I can base my answer uh, on. I live in Calgary. There's a tremendous amount of newcomers to Canada and Calgary, and to be frank, it's sometimes it's very obvious who's a newcomer who hasn't been here for very long, and who's been here for 5 or 10 years, and the difference, it can be stark, and for a Canadian, it can be irritating, frankly, that the 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 way that the the way that a Canadian sort of, as I said before, Canadian is sort of an attitude, um, and there's a there's an understated politeness that is that every Canadian wants to exude, and they expect back the same thing from them. And there's people who arrive from cultures that are much more aggressive, or that just do things in a different way, that are more blunt. Um, and Canadian is quite nuanced, and that can be confusing, I think, for newcomers too. So if somebody says, well, maybe yes, they often mean no. Uh, but if you tell somebody no, you'd be like, oh, wow, 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 is that ever terrible? So this is a double double is a coffee with two sugars and two creams at a Tim Hortons, which is a coffee shop. So, but they're everywhere. So it's it can be, I think it can be confusing, for people who come to Canada, at the beginning, as to say, what are the rules that where there's no rules, how it can be, you have to decode Canada, and a lot of the rules are subtle, and so it's very difficult to decode those behavioral rules, because of the subtleness of them. This is where you guys can really help people. I think there is no handbook of the subtleness of Canadian, the Canadian approach. Um, it can be subtle, but it can also be quite aggressive. We're known as very tough negotiators. When we negotiate, I work in business, and in my past business, a big part of my negotiation was always negotiating with people from other countries, and Americans, and Europeans or Asians, and uh, our subtle ways can be very effective, because underneath that is a real rigidity. That's a cultural thing, and that is, a newcomer needs to understand that, and it won't come right away. It will come with help and advice.
I think that's a great point. I have lived in Canada now about 22 years, and in my first 5 and first 10 years, I didn't know at all what Brad is talking about. Okay. Because it takes time to understand what Canadian culture means. And then Brad was talking about subtleness, and it's very difficult to catch until you actually experience it and get to know. So I think that's one of the reasons Emmanuel and I developed this program, because we like to coach about this subtleness and some engagement and Canadian culture, which is very different from South Korean culture and American cultures I somebody experienced. So I think that takes time and then a learning process. And I totally agree with the Brad about that.
Yeah. And remember, Canadians are not Americans and would be offended that ew, I'm not American, I'm Canadian. It's way better. So every country, I think, has their bias and, feels like their team is the most important team.
Yeah, especially I think one more thing I like to mention is that nowadays we see more immigrants from Asian countries and other parts of the world, not just from European countries. So I think Asian culture and other cultures, I think Canadian culture is a little bit more similar to European cultures, right? But from Asian cultures and those cultures can be quite different when you first come in here. So I think that's very important. So it can be rude to Canadians if you behave like what you have done in your home country. So it's very important. You have to be very careful about that, because Canadians do not say directly about they were offended and you are rude. They say very politely. So you may not notice it. They were offended. I think that's kind of subtleness, right? So, Brad, could you elaborate a little bit more about the beer? You are very nice, nicely talk about it. Oh, thank you.
Yeah, it's a good point, and I think that this is probably the hardest thing that a new immigrant will have, and it'll have an economic consequence to you. To I think that, as a Canadian, I respect all of the different cultures around the world, um, but within Canada, I'm comfortable with the Canadian culture that I grew up with, and I really don't want to see that change. I don't want to have Canada become more aggressive, but I want to have lots of immigrants in who then uh, adopt a Canadian culture. And so this sense of subtleness is, what's an example is let's say I'm waiting in line, and uh, the Canadians are quite orderly about, if you're waiting in line, you don't touch the person in front of you. You don't get close enough so that you even breeze their jacket. You leave a little space. And if somebody comes in and sees that space and they just go in front of me, uh, I would be, wow, that, wow, is that ever rude? But in certain cultures, that's just how you do it. So it's, and would I say something to the person? I might do this. I might go, that would be like me yelling at them. So, you know, or if somebody's trying to buy something from me and they're negotiating, and they're negotiating aggressively, I might just, my eyes might just go, and that's it. That's me in this complete disagreement.
Way different from where I come from. I can tell you that.
Yeah. So you have to be patient. You have to pay attention. You have to understand that it's different here. Um, that, but that everybody is really welcome. It's uh, but there is an expectation that the culture, the way that you do things from a nuanced perspective will need to change and evolve to really continue to build upon the experiment that is Canada. But it is not, it's not a melting pot. It's, you know, you want to, you can maintain your own identity, your own religion, your own language, your everything, but the Canadianness of it, you need to learn it.
And it will come naturally. It's better to be aware and adapt and have learn basically, because nobody knows about this when they come, but they can learn through time. Some faster, some take their time.
Absolutely. You know, and a big part of it is, like, if you're going for a job interview or something like that, is just paying attention to the person who's across from you, and if they look kind of annoyed, or if they're happy, they're generally happy. If they're a little bit annoyed, they're generally annoyed. You know, the subtle things. Canadians are generally quick to be smiling and happy, and like to see everything as on the positive side, not on the negative side. And if you come across as seeing things on the negative side, then somebody would imagine, oh, that's what they're going to be like to work with. It'll be negative. I'll have a crappy time working with that person. I don't want to hire them. You know, so it's so you know, generally kind of look at the sunny side of everything, um, but also paying attention to that uh, what is annoying the other person as well. But maintaining a happy disposition is really an important part. You know, everyone says around the world, "Oh, Canadians are so friendly." We, you know, we are, and we are. Maybe we're not inside sometimes, but outwardly, we would rather have things not be in aggressive conflict, and that comes across as happy. But we have no different. There's no difference between the level of irritation you hold inside as somebody. It's just the way it's displayed. And so I think if it's displayed, you know, oh, Canadians are happy, or they say, if you bump into somebody, I always say, oh, I'm sorry, even though they bumped into me. So it's just an outward recognition that the person around you is affected by you, uh, and that's kind of, I mean, that's just for me. I grew up that way. It's just normal, but it can be, I think, difficult for a newcomer.
Then that brings us to the $1 million question. Does Canada need more or less immigrants, culturally and economically? From a cultural or economical and an economical perspective as well.
Sure. Two two separate questions, I think. So let's do one at a time, because I think they're different answers. So the one, does Canada need more immigrants? Yes. Our population growth is pretty stagnant. So, you know, I'm not sure even how many people are in Canada, maybe around 39 million or something like that. But there's not a lot of people in Canada. You know, it's like a suburb of a big city in some countries, you know, the whole country. So it's, and our birth rate's low, and people are retiring. Uh, and there's a lot of certain jobs that, you know, people don't want to do. So there's, you know, and your team can help people identify what that is. Um, Nobody is opposed to immigrants. I shouldn't say nobody. There there are people within Canada, um, who don't want immigrants. There's people in every country. So Canada's no different than that. And if you come here, you're going to run across it, probably. Um, and just know that the vast majority of Canadians are not that way. But those who don't want immigrants to come, sometimes they can be quite vocal, and they can be noticeable. but they're a very small percentage of the population, and you just have to deal with it. It's we call them idiots or jerks kind of thing, from you're just like, oh God, those people. And that's, I think you see that in any country around the world. So Canada's no different. It's got that side. But for the vast majority, and I speak for the vast majority of Canadians and people who've been Canadian for a long time, we definitely need immigration. Do we need a cultural immigration into Canada? I think probably most Canadians in that one would say no. Is that we're happy with the culture it is now. Are we enriched by the introduction of other cultures into Canada? 100% yes. So the perspective that people from another culture bring, um, the the if you here's great. If I think of the last 5 restaurants I went to, I think it was I ate Indian, Thai, Korean, Italian, uh,
Really?
and and then I had a steakhouse.
Wow, what a
And
variety! Yeah.
it's, and my life is way better because of that. So, uh, so there is an enrichment on that. And if I look in my cupboard about just the food that we cook with, uh, you know, I don't make things that other people think are Canadian. I like to cook, and generally my food recipes. If you look at my recipe, there's not a single book that says Canadian recipes. Uh, so 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 there's this immense enrichment from that.
I think your point of food actually really resonated with me. So you talked about the variety of food, right? So my city, you had lived in Sault Ste. Marie, and
Yeah,
it was all Italian food used to be, but nowadays it is getting more diverse, and we have more Mexican and also Indian restaurants. Unfortunately, we don't have Korean restaurant yet, but
yeah,
so I think that's another thing you mentioned. Bread is in Calgary. I'm in a small city, so what kind of different food you can enjoy, and that's another cultural things. Food is also very
that's
important.
right. And there's an economic ability. There's an entrepreneurial ability in food. It's often where um, when I grew up, there wasn't such a diverse amount of different restaurants from particularly there was like the Chinese food and that type of thing. Um, but now it's every culture around the world. You can, particularly if you live in a bigger city, you can find anything that's uh, that's made in the world from a cultural perspective, from a food palette perspective, even from buying goods. It's there isn't there isn't a limit really. It's a real place where entrepreneurs, immigrant entrepreneurs, have brought in the opportunity to experience not just in food but in products and goods and techniques and services. So all of that is you can just find it around down the street.
I like to add one more thing in your comment. Actually, my wife makes beautiful and tasty sushi, and
Yeah.
I said, I know, brother, you love eating sushi too, right?
I live on Eglinton in Toronto, and you can literally find in a span of just a 10-minute walk a restaurant from every place on earth with this background.
Yeah.
So that's something powerful. That's something I believe you don't really find in many other places, in many other countries. And I
Yeah.
like to taste food from different cultures, so I'm happy about that. There's not a shortage of choices. for me.
Okay, Brad. So now let's talk about a little bit more serious one. So you already mentioned that there are very few people who still are against about immigrants, and they are taking away jobs from Canadians. So what kind of perspective can you provide in terms of job opportunities for immigrants and non-immigrants in Canada? And then, do you have any view about that?
Hmm. So I'll start by saying that Canada is very close to the United States, right? We share the longest, I think it's the longest international border of any country in the world with the United States. And there's 10 times the population in the United States as in Canada. It might be even more. Um, and the news, you get a lot of United States news in Canada just because there's a lot of news being produced down there, and with the TV and that you hear a lot in the internet, and the United States news reports a very negative view of immigration often. There's a um, past presidents of the United States that were like, oh, immigrants are bad. Canada is not the United States. So that's the first thing. And so the view of immigration in Canada is not that it's taking away jobs. Um, people, those people who are opposed to immigration, and I say is a very very small people, they're generally just frustrated with change. And immigration does represent change. It used to be when I went to school, which was near where Emmanuel lives now in Ontario. Every student in my class looked like me, except there were girls too. So girls and boys, but they all looked like me. And we had in our school, which was 1,700 people in the high school, we had one black person and maybe two Chinese people and one East Indian person. That's it. And everybody
Wow,
else looked like
wow,
me.
totally different.
And now, you go to a classroom in Toronto, and maybe out of 30 students, four look like me, or five look like me. So, but if you go to the small towns, it can still be 80% look like me. So small towns is less immigration; it's more kind of people who look like me. But and I have three kids in their 20s, and they don't even think about someone who doesn't look like them as being different, as being an immigrant, as being a threat. It doesn't even occur to them. I'm sure of it. So so I'm older, and to me, I don't see it as a threat. My father and my mother, they're both alive, thank goodness. My dad's 91. He doesn't see it as a threat. My mom are in their late 80s. They don't see it as a threat, but they do see the change, and that does just upset them sometimes. So someone has to be aware of that. But fact is there's more jobs than there are people to fill them in Canada, and so there's good opportunities. And I personally, on a personal level, I don't see it as any issue. I don't see it as an immigrant taking a job. Um, and as we talked about, there it can be a struggle for people coming here and getting established, and the jobs that you may be taking are the jobs that nobody else wants. Uh, but those jobs can provide a foundation of economic stability. If you're coming here with a low cash flow, you want to get a job right away. The worst thing would be to run out of cash. Um, but there is lots of jobs for that. So and you don't have to seek your own community to find a job. There's lots of jobs everywhere.
And I would add to that that it's not just the Canadian, the born Canadians that say that. I know many immigrants that have been here for 10, 15 years that have the same narrative that the new immigrants are taking the current jobs for Canadians. So it's Canadian spread.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, which sort of speaks to this underlying idea of prejudice, right? Um, and there's prejudice throughout the world. There's prejudice throughout Canada. Um, there's prejudice within individual immigrant groups. You know, ooh, I don't want my daughter to marry this person from another immigrant group, or I don't want them to marry someone who looks like me. So there's uh, it is it is no different in Canada than it is probably in in the country where you're watching this. Uh, it is everywhere, but there is no reason to not come here because of that.
And I'll take this opportunity to remind our listeners about our program, the Immigrant Success Canada. Charlie and I built this program and we're constantly building it and adjusting it and tweaking it. We built it in such a way that we wish we would have had it when we came here. It's important to have partners, it's important to have mentors, to have coaches, and to have people close to you. And even before you actually make the move, if you want to find more information about our program and also find links to this episode and other previous podcast episodes, you can do so on our website www.isc-go.com. So ISC Immigrant Success Canada-go.com.
Okay, thanks, Brad. We really appreciate your participation today. So, do you have any other final comment for us?
Um, I think if I were to leave, Canada and immigrate somewhere, um, I would be probably most worried about, especially with a different language. I would be especially most worried about fitting in. Um, so I think there's, and on an economic perspective, when I think about the jobs that I've gotten almost all my jobs because I knew somebody. I apply, but really I applied to, areas, times when I needed work and I applied. It was generally the ones, the job that I got is because I knew somebody. So it's important to build up that network. I think what you guys are doing is phenomenal. You're creating a network, and don't be afraid, but really, um, you know, build up a network, and don't just stick with your own cultural group when you come here as well. I think it's there, there there's a feeling of security with your own cultural group, but if you just join organizations, I'm a member of Toastmasters, Charlie, as well. I think we've got 27 people in our group, and only 3 of them were actually born in Canada, and and we're it's a community now. It's a community, and somebody lost their job. They said, "Hey, does anyone know any work?" And somebody found the job for them, like that. So um, that's the kind of opportunities that exist.
Oh,
Amazing.
fantastic.
Great.
Thank you, Brad. We really
Okay.
appreciate it.
No problem. Thanks.
Thank you for listening to us. Thank you, Brad, as Charlie said. And we hope to have you as a guest on another episode, many other episodes throughout time. You've been listening to Immigrant Success Canada's podcast, the coaching program for a successful and happy life in Canada. Until the next time,